How's everyone doing today?
Pretty good.
Wonderful.
Wonderful? Yeah.
Just drinking coffee, looking out my window. It's a good day.
Yeah. That is a good day.
Cheers.
That-
Oversized
mug.
coffee mug. It's as big as
yeah, I
my
don't know what
face.
we're doing today.
Oh, Blake.
Lex is hydrating.
Mhm. I might have went a little too hard last week on coffee, and I was like, "Oh man, this is not good. I really shouldn't be having, especially that I'm doing instant coffee, which don't judge me, but
No judgment.
Like,
so much coffee. So yeah,
that's funny.
I usually try and balance out any coffee with like another thing of water.
There you go.
I'll be honest, Rob, I almost wore a yellow shirt. That
Oh,
would've been
really?
great.
Yeah, I guess I
Yeah.
didn't tell you what color I was gonna wear. So funny story. Blake and I both have the same like salmon sort of reddish shirt,
Oh,
and
yeah.
sometimes we'll wear it on the same day. And so
Usually we wear it for the same day.
that's
Yeah.
fantastic.
something in the air, like the phase of the moon, tells us. So, anyways, I slacked him this morning and told him, and he's like, "I'm not gonna
Don't wear yellow.
Well, I'm not either, but totally failed to, coordinate. Actually, it worked out though.
Honestly, I think it would have been more hilarious if we both went yellow. So
That would have been fun. You're wearing the Crema uniform, so if I had worn my black T-shirt, that would have been safe as well.
yeah, there was a meeting the other day where the first like 6 or 7 people were all wearing just a plain like black T-shirt. It was like, yep,
Yeah.
it's about right.
Fantastic.
Not uncommon, that's for sure.
I feel like especially now, like I have a fair share of graphic tees that are black, but like because I only show
Yeah.
this part here, I'm like, whatever, I'm just gonna put this on. It's comfortable. You'll be fine.
I swear.
Yeah.
Yep.
Wow. Hmm.
All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. So first, thanks for joining us, everyone. So a little bit about Crema. We're a digital product agency helping individuals and companies thrive through creativity, technology, and culture. So here at Crema, we use TypeScript as a team for basically all of our JavaScript projects, both client, internal, whatever. So we figured just having some conversations about TypeScript would be pretty fun, since we also actually just did a book club as a whole dev craft team on TypeScript, which was really fun. It's called Effective TypeScript by, crap, I should have prepared this.
Dan
Vanderkamp?
Vanderkamp.
There we go, Dan Vanderkamp. So that was a great book. I definitely recommend reading that if you're interested in TypeScript. Okay, first I'll do some introductions. I'm Blake, developer here at Crema. We also have Rob. Wave, Rob.
Hello.
We
I'm
have,
a lead architect here at Crema.
yep, we have Mandy,
Hello.
and we have Lex.
Hello, hello.
All right. So while we're chatting, feel free to please drop any questions or comments you have. We'll try and get to them if we can. Yeah, let's go ahead and get started. So let's just start at the top. What is TypeScript? I guess because some people have tons of different opinions on this, so I'm kind of curious to see like gut reaction. Like, how would you describe TypeScript?
Okay, so someone explained this to me, and it could have been Blake, but TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript. So it's JavaScript plus something. So that's how I think about it. I think of TypeScript.
Yeah, that
I
is
mean,
exactly
short and
right.
sweet.
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect.
It's like a layer on top of JavaScript, which makes it easy to add into any existing JavaScript project. But it basically just adds type safety, type checking to your projects, which we'll get into types, I think, in a second. But that's how I think of it too. Just a layer on top of a JavaScript project.
Yep.
Yeah. It is definitely a superset of JavaScript, but yeah, again, that superset is the static typing in the system that typically in JavaScript, it's a dynamically typed language, right? So you can get type errors JavaScript, but they're usually runtime errors. And that's the last place you want to have those errors, right? So TypeScript gives you a system that will display those errors to you when you're in development versus later in production. So that's kind of the way I think of it.
Yeah, I think another part of TypeScript, right? It's a superset, it has types, but it can do that because it is also a compiler, right? It's also compiling your TypeScript into JavaScript. And so at that compile time is when it's doing its static type checking. But because it's a compiler, you can also do other things like transpile from one version of JavaScript to another, kind of like Babel, where you could write kind of really modern JavaScript features also in TypeScript, and then it compiles it so that you can use it in maybe older browsers. So it gets you some of the benefits of a compiler, which most web projects use anyway. So I think that part is really important.
Yeah, and to your note, I think that's one of the things that took me a while to really understand, that it's also a compiler. And you know, and correct me if I'm wrong, and it's also I know there's some other things involved, like Babel comes in and helps translate TypeScript into JavaScript in certain cases and things like that. So I feel like there's a lot. Well, I feel like there's a lot in the background, or like the black box of TypeScript that goes on, but it feels so integrated, especially with Visual Studio Code or VS Code. It feels so integrated that I forget that, hey, there's a couple of things going on, especially when I'm reading like the TypeScript errors and things like that. So
Yeah, I think that's another important piece there. TypeScript is it's an ecosystem too, right? You have Visual Studio Code, which uses TypeScript features to give you IDE-like stuff, which is really cool. You have the definitely typed, all the @types packages that can give you type definitions. It's really cool. It's all that stuff. Well, we've mentioned this a lot. So what are types and how do they work in TypeScript? Who wants to tackle this one?
I can start. So types are things like strings, numbers, booleans that are, there's like primitive types in JavaScript already, but like Rob was saying, JavaScript is a dynamically typed language. So there isn't a type assigned to a variable when it's first written. The type is assigned dynamically at runtime. And so with static typing, which is what TypeScript gives you, those types can be defined ahead of time so that you know, like, this variable should be a string, and I'm telling it right now that it should be, which gives you that quicker feedback of knowing that this thing that I think is a string actually isn't, so I should fix it.
Yeah, I think I would describe it as a blueprint for your variable or your function, or your class, so you can, at a very high level, initially understand what exactly you're working with. And it can be, depending on how the types are named, it can even be really helpful just if you're just quickly reading through a sheet of code. So
yeah, it describes the shape of the various structures in your code. So whether that's like a data structure, so an object that has certain fields on it that have certain values, or the shape of a function, what parameters the function has, what those values need to be, what you expect to have returned from that function. So it can help validate, even when you're writing a function, that you are actually achieving the goal you set out to achieve. If you define that return type on the function, maybe we can show some examples of some of these soon here. But yeah, really kind of defining the shape of the various structures in your code.
Yeah. I think the important bit is, like, JavaScript already has types. They're just not explicit, and they're dynamic, whereas in TypeScript, they can be explicit. You can say this thing is a string, but you can also let it be inferred. So I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, and actually in our chat, Parav Patel, sorry if I'm butchering your name, he brings up a good point that types are like a category of a value. So So when we think about an email address, or yeah, an email address would be represented as a string. It is a very small subset of all strings. so it's the category is string. And so you kind of can get into category theory too with types, where like, well, all possible numbers are assignable to type number, right? And you can get into product types, which are like objects with all the possible permutations of their fields and their values. And so yeah, there's, as you dig into static types, maybe initially, at least for me, I kind of found myself happening onto a lot of category theory and ideas that were really confusing to me at the time, but were helpful once I kind of wrapped my head around some of those concepts, at least the basic concepts. But yeah, that's a really good point.
Yep. Yeah, Rob, you mentioned maybe showing what kind of types. Did you want to?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and share my screen. It's asking me for access, even though I've done that before. Maybe I haven't done it in this version of Zoom. Apologies. Keep talking.
Yeah. So maybe while we're doing this, why don't we get on to the difference between dynamic types with static types, and maybe even what's wrong, if there is something that's wrong with dynamic types.
I think we've mentioned a little bit of it already, but with dynamic types, you have to wait until runtime to see that something is mismatched or that you have an error, where with static types, you get that feedback sooner, and you can see like all the places in your code where it would need to be updated, versus maybe you are running your code, but you're only looking at a specific part of it and you're missing other places where, like, if you change an object type and you don't realize you're using it in multiple places, you might only update it in one spot, and then your code will get out of sync.
Yeah, sure.
So this is the TypeScript website, and they have a playground that you can go and just try out TypeScript. So I'll write some normal JavaScript, and then you can see kind of how we could apply TypeScript to it. So, or add types into it. So if I wanted to write a function, say hi, something like that. It's a function. It's going to take some variable. Let's say I'll just call it A for now because I can't think on the spot. And I'm going to return a string that says there A. All right. So right now, I think I have strict mode turned on. So there's various configurations of TypeScript that can be more or less strict. Trying to think of what the easiest way to, well, maybe it's not important to show that.
Yeah, I think you can still run it without even doing the type.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and run this. Use my name. Okay, and if I go to the logs, actually hit save. Oh, I need a console log, sorry. Console log. Will it work? Run. There we go. Okay, so here we've got hi there, Rob. Missing space. It's not elegant, people. But you can see here already TypeScript, if I hover over this little squiggly here, and I'll zoom in a little bit, this little squiggly is an error, and it's saying A implicitly has an any type. Basically, I haven't told it what type it should be. And so if I say it's going to be type string, and this is how you annotate types, you kind of put you have your variable name and then a colon and then your type. So it's a type string now. So now it knows, yeah, I can concatenate hi there with the string of A here. So, so now I'm not getting an error. Well, now if I wanted to pass a number to this, I'm going to get another error here. And it's going to say argument of type 2 is not assignable to the parameter of type string. So basically, I can't assign a number to a string. So that's an example of how now while I'm writing code, I'm getting this error versus in production or something, I would get something like this. Hi there too. So it's still valid JavaScript. It can still run. It may not compile though in your project setup. So as you're building your app and there's a type error, it's going to not compile and prevent you from actually sending that likely invalid JavaScript out to your users. So
Yeah,
another
something I also think is interesting is looking at the compiled output and seeing like, oh, it really does kind of just eliminate the types there, but
Yep.
it's still kind of what you wrote, just without the types.
Exactly.
It's a really good way to see like what is TypeScript and what is not TypeScript, like if you're kind of learning TypeScript.
Yeah, and it gets more, it can be more complex. So say we want to define a data type in our application called user. We can define one, name, type, string, age, number. So that's a basic example. So now if I'm going to create an actual user, I want it to be a type user. I'm just going to create an object and it needs to conform to this shape. So even right now, if I hover over this assignment here, it's saying empty object is missing the following properties from type user, name and age. So I'm going to add name. And you can see here, it actually knows if I hit Control Spacebar, it's going to tell me what fields are actually available on that type, which properties it's expecting.
That's my favorite part of it, is just having those properties already filled in. I have opted to not read certain documentation just because it's already typed, and I'm just like, oh, maybe I can just mull around. Maybe there's a function like this or something like this.
Exactly. Yeah.
And
Yeah, I think to that point, TypeScript, the types are almost a form of documentation, right? That, in
Yeah.
fact, a form of documentation that is harder to get out of sync with the actual reality, which is really useful. Cool. Thanks for sharing, Rob.
Yeah. All right.
All right. So yeah, we were talking about like dynamic types and what's wrong with them. And I think something that Mandy brought up, right? So the errors, if there are errors, don't pop up until runtime. I think to add to that, sometimes the errors don't pop up until way later, right? You might not run into it as you're testing it, might push the code to production, and way later some user does something you probably never expected and they get to a runtime error. Well, maybe TypeScript could have helped you there because yeah, it was a runtime error that you just forgot to test.
Yeah, for sure. Like it's not always obvious that an error is going to emerge, and you'd have to exercise all of that code in order to potentially hit that bug. So
yeah, and the compiler, and I know we've mentioned this before, but it just forces you to deal with everything, which I definitely starting out can be a bit of a battle to track through which types are which. But I mean, it in the long run, I'm glad that I just handled it then before trying to dig through, code after production, trying to figure out, where the mess up was or the mismatch was. So
yeah, Patel asked again, he had a question about the semicolons in that type interface, and the answer there, they're not required, they are optional. So definitely we would recommend using a linter with like prettier or something like that to just kind of enforce a standard there, so you don't have to think about it. But yeah, when they're on separate lines, they're optional. I think obviously if they're on a single line, it has to use those as a delimiter between the types. But yep.
Another thing, like along the lines of what Lex was saying with documentation, like having those types in there, like the user type that Rob just showed, it clarifies your intent. Like this user should have a name and an age, and it will tell you if you like mistype it or like mistype one of the properties. And so it kind of reduces the cognitive overhead of having to think, okay, what is this object? What should it have? Like having to like search through your code and see how it was used other places. If you have a type that's defined, you don't have to keep thinking about what it should be, like the one spot to look for the source of truth.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's something I always like to say is that it kind of frees up, like you said, a part of your mind to really focus on whatever kind of unique problem you're trying, whatever logical problem you're trying to solve or UI problem, and not have to worry about, oh, did I mistype this thing or what
Mhm.
properties are on this object? Like it kind of frees you up to think about more of the fun problems.
How do you all tend to organize your types? I mean, so types can be declared in any file, any TypeScript file, and imported, into a module where you're going to utilize it. Say we have a function somewhere in our code or a React component that needs to accept a property that is a user. Um, do you kind of find yourself putting that user type somewhere in relation to all your other code, like some centralized place, or I don't know, what has been
Yeah.
your experience there?
I typically, for objects, I put them on their own file. So I'll have a separate file for whatever object types I have. And then a lot of the rest just depends on, is this function or thing only for this? Am I only going to use it once here? If that's the case, then I leave it on that page and I will have like a type definition closer to the top. But most of the times, especially with my objects and stuff, I have like a types folder, and then I organize the types based off the objects, and they all get their own file.
Yeah, same. It tends to
Okay.
be like
Yeah.
domain specific data. So we're interfacing with an API and we get back users always of a certain shape. We get back other documents of specific shapes, and those really are representative of kind of the problem domain. And so they seem to kind of belong in a centralized sort of abstract place and get referenced by, the rest of the application. So yeah, I think another example would be like the type definition of like a React component's properties, the props. Those are really defining. That's really defining the API for that component, right? How should it be used? And so, again, like you were saying, Lex, that kind of belongs with that component because it's describing something unique to that component. So, but it can get. I mean, just like anything, just like any code organization, it can sometimes seem clear, and then sometimes in the thick of it, it can be a little confusing. So
Yeah. So maybe real quick, how does TypeScript compare to other typed languages? Maybe like Java or whatever.
So yeah, like I guess compared to Java, I don't know, it seems from the beginning it seemed similar enough. It yeah, it seemed similar enough, but I don't know. I think that it's hard to compare to Java, me specifically, with TypeScript being more functional programming oriented. And the things about TypeScript that I really like, again, is just being able to type something out, put a dot, okay, here's the parameter or whatever you need. And I believe JavaScript, I mean, not Java, JavaScript, Java already has that. I don't know if that's related to the fact that it's a strictly typed language or not. I think that's more of object oriented thing. But
Yeah. And I
yeah,
think
so
like Java, TypeScript is structurally typed, which also is known as, I think, duck typing, which means basically if two things have the same structure, the same shape, they are the same type. It doesn't matter if you've made two types with different names or something doesn't have a name. As long as two things have the same structure or shape, they are the same type, which is useful, but it's good to know going in that it just checks the structure of the shapes.
yeah, like you said, it's good to know going in. Every language is going to have its own characteristics that are unique to it. similar and different to other languages. I think in a lot of ways, TypeScript, it needs to be able to describe JavaScript at the end of the day, right? So there are certain decisions that the language authors have made to allow that to be possible, right? So I think structural typing, I don't know if that was informed by that, but that definitely is a convention that's very common in kind of the JS ecosystem. And that would be compared to like nominal typing, whereas the actual name of the type is what matters. You could have, like in our user example, you could have user A and user B, and they could both have the exact same fields. But if a function expects a user B and you try to pass it a user A, it would be invalid. Whereas in TypeScript, you could, because they both of those interfaces, as long as they have the same structure, or the same overlapping required structure, would be valid. So yeah, again, something to keep in mind.
Yep. I think let's move on to a fun question. So JavaScript versus TypeScript. Why would you use TypeScript? Which one would you recommend over the other? In what cases? I mean, I have an opinion if you guys want it.
I have an opinion.
I feel like the bigger the project and the more people on it, the more it makes sense to use TypeScript. If it's something like smaller that you're just testing things on, you wouldn't necessarily need it. But I don't know, the more complexity that gets added to it, the more it makes sense to use TypeScript. I guess other reasons you might not use TypeScript is if you started a project without it. Just depending on at what point it makes sense. If you made the decision to add TypeScript later on, it might not make sense at that point in the project, but
yeah, I would say there's no time like the beginning of a project
yeah,
to use TypeScript. So, I mean, it's hard to predict how complicated any set of code will get.
Sure.
So I think my instinct is to start with TypeScript. Of course, I don't want to go through all the configuration, figuring out, exactly the tools I need to make it a nice experience. So I definitely always start from like a boilerplate or template repo that gives me all the niceties, and so I can just hit the ground running and I know exactly what I'm doing. So I would definitely suggest doing that. Any tool set you use, you should have like a nice baseline to start from. Yeah, I think the converting to TypeScript story is another topic altogether, but yeah, starting fresh feels nice.
Yeah, because there's that tendency to think, oh, TypeScript adds a lot of overhead. But I feel like that's definitely true when you're learning TypeScript. There is definitely a cost to writing code in TypeScript while you're learning it. But for me, the more I got familiar with TypeScript, it actually sped up my development. And so now I'm at the point where if I start a project, as long as I have the choice, I use TypeScript just because it makes me more efficient as a developer. Even if it's like a script that I'm just writing to like fetch some URL and like read its JSON or something, like I don't care. I use TypeScript. But that's definitely a me personal opinion.
I find that jumping into a project that has TypeScript in it feels a lot easier to navigate too. And yeah, I also lean more on starting a project with TypeScript. Again, it's a more convenient way for me to navigate through all the code and again, look at my objects and functions or whatever at a glance and like, okay, have an idea of how to use that or manipulate that, whenever I need it.
Yeah. And I think coming to like the migrating a code base from JavaScript to TypeScript question, that there's so many like it depends like in there. If you feel like you have a really good grasp of TypeScript and you have a good grasp of the code base, migrating can be easy, but you almost never have a good grasp of a code base if it's written in JavaScript. And everyone is on their own spectrum of where they are in learning TypeScript. And so all those things have to be taken into account.
Yeah, I think that the value is you're getting some of these concepts and assumptions about what the project is doing kind of out of your head or collective heads and actually into the code base, and letting the compiler tell you when you're breaking that convention, you're misusing something that was decided earlier should work a different way or should be structured a different way. So I found that I can offload a huge amount of that effort and work to the computer, which is great. And I can think specifically about how I would describe certain concepts with types. So I think sometimes I've kind of found that if I can't describe a concept with the types, I may not fully comprehend it, or maybe too complicated. Maybe it should be broken up differently. So I found it as a tool that actually helps me write better code. And I'll obviously avoid dumb errors as well, to mapping over undefined, or something like that. So those kinds of mistakes sort of just go away for the most part, as long as you're accurately representing your data with your types. And a whole new level of kind of problem solving, you have full kind of bandwidth to focus on, right? The actual domain that you're writing the application for. So I find it kind of shifts that, it shifts where you can focus your energy. That's huge. And like you said, Lex, like actually being able to dig in and navigate the code base and see, oh, this is a type that gets used everywhere. That's important. That's an important concept that's been codified. You see it. You don't have to read it in documentation or have somebody tell it to you.
Yep.
So it's huge.
Maybe we'll move on to the web ecosystem. So is it moving towards everything TypeScript? Are we seeing more and more people pick up TypeScript in the web community? Like what's everyone's finger on that pulse? How do they feel?
I mean, I'm trying to find the stats here. I probably won't be able to live. I should have thought of doing this before, but there's a huge proportion of new NPM packages now that are being published that are written in TypeScript, so that say a library that you're going to NPM install, it's going to come with types. So if you're using TypeScript, you're going to be able to get native types for that library available to you. Now, of course, they can be of greater or lesser quality depending on the author's understanding of TypeScript as well. But that's definitely a shift. We've started to see major libraries like Material UI. I'm trying to think, Redux. All of these libraries are coming now with their own type definitions natively, whereas before we had definitely typed, which is it was like a scoped package that contained third-party submitted type definitions for various libraries. And so you'd install your library A, and then you'd look for @types/library A, and maybe it'd be there, maybe it wouldn't. Got Siri talking to me. So I've just noticed a huge shift there. Shut up, Siri. Okay.
Yeah, and Rob brought up @types, which actually answers a question I see in the chat there. So are there TS libs that convert existing JS to TS compatible? Yeah, like definitely typed, or the @types repo does that. There are probably thousands and thousands of community source type definitions for untyped NPM packages. And so usually if you like install an NPM package, run it in your code, TypeScript will actually say, hey, have you tried, this doesn't have types, have you tried installing @types/ the name of the package? And you can almost always just run that command and it installs types for that package. It's been a long time since I've ran into a package that didn't have types somewhere in the ecosystem.
Yeah, it's starting to feel like the quality of a library can kind of be gauged by does it have native TypeScript? It's kind of type definitions, or is it even written in TypeScript? That's even better, because then it can automatically generate real types based off of its code. But otherwise, a lot of libraries, they're just too big to rewrite, and so they will provide their own type definitions. So that's kind of like premier or premium quality. And then you have libraries that are super popular enough for TypeScript users to have gone like, I can write definitions for the public API of this library, all its methods and all that, because it's valuable to me. And so that'd be kind of like a tier two, second tier sort of citizen right now. But it seems like more and more libraries are bumping up into that sort of premium experience.
Yeah, it definitely feels like TypeScript is what all the cool kids are doing. That's like the vibe I feel whenever I'm in npm and installing new packages or whatever. And yeah, it's rarer than not for me to find a package that doesn't have types or doesn't have the @ types.
Yeah, and I think it helps that TypeScript itself has a lot of backing, right? It's a Microsoft product, right? Microsoft has backed it, and also Microsoft builds Visual Studio Code with it. And so there's a lot of momentum there, which helps the community adopt it because they feel comfortable because it won't just go away.
And we're kind of to the point where if you go on Twitter or something like that, you're going to see a lot of people who are kind of begrudgingly kind of being pulled into it, and you'll see.
Yes, I mean, noticed that.
So there's it's not necessarily just that everybody loves it and is just super happy that now they're having to think about types at this level. But I think it also speaks to the success of TypeScript because teams as a whole are adopting this, and individuals maybe have their own personal opinions about whether it's valuable or not, or how productive or unproductive it makes them feel. And so there's a lot of conversation around that kind of drama aspect of it. But again, it's only because it's being used. So that's, I think, overall points that it's really gaining that public adoption.
Yeah.
So,
and I think it's also been gaining in relation to the other kind of typed JavaScript languages like CopyScript, Flow. I'm sure there are other ones I can't remember. It's definitely been gaining, and those have been waning, as what I'll say. So I don't even see CopyScript anymore. And Flow, I see less and less projects that have Flow types or use Flow.
Yeah, I feel like all those other alt.js kind of variants are still super niche, and they, whereas TypeScript, I feel like has kind of breached through that barrier of being kind of this really small community, and now it's as mainstream as like an alt.js system can be. So I'm sure it pales in comparison compared to all the vanilla JS that's out there and all the npm libraries that are just written in JavaScript or for Node. But definitely I think if you were to scope down to the last few years, that number would actually be skewing really high TypeScript. So
yeah, I think it was the last like Stack Overflow developer survey. Wish I pulled up these numbers. I'm gonna have to do this from memory. It was like JavaScript was still the #1, but TypeScript was kind of maybe top 5, maybe top 6 or something for like languages that developers say they're using professionally. And then also in like the most loved languages, it was like #2 just behind Rust. So it's definitely got a lot of momentum in the developer community.
mm-hmm.
All right, well, I'm looking through the chat, making sure that we've covered everything. Yeah. So maybe what would be good is to talk about maybe how to get started in TypeScript. What would everyone recommend?
For me, I started with a couple of Egghead.io and Udemy tutorials. The way I kind of like to learn is to learn something separate first. Like I knew JavaScript before, but just learning like TypeScript in isolated examples. And then trying it on a smaller project, like a personal project, was helpful to see it in the context of React and actually using it in different ways. And something that I find helpful just as I'm learning code in general is to read other people's code. So if you have like an example project of someone else on your team, or if you have like a good GitHub repo that you trust, you could go through and read code there. And it's just been helpful to be on an actual client project that's using it as well, and just kind of getting in and learning as you write code.
Yeah, I think you definitely covered it. Another resource I'll throw out there is TypeScript. Just the TypeScript website has a really good like handbook for getting into TypeScript. It has a number of different like introduction points where you could say I'm a JavaScript developer looking to learn TypeScript, or I'm another object-oriented developer looking to learn TypeScript, or I'm a new developer looking to learn TypeScript. So it has different entry points, and then it has a great like handbook that walks you through it and then points you to other resources to continue to expand that knowledge. So I definitely recommend that.
That's really cool. I didn't know they had the different entry points. That's awesome.
I think it's recent because they just kind of redid their website, so it might be new.
Okay. Yeah.
I just saw it this morning.
That's really cool. Yeah, like Mandy said, the egghead tutorials, YouTube's been great. Really love YouTube to learn anything. I just learned how to like replace my radio in my car. Like YouTube's great. So
with TypeScript.
with TypeScript, yeah. No, yeah, I mostly YouTube. Also, blogs have helped me a lot. I've used Medium a lot. And then, if I get into any issues or any errors, Stack Overflow has been great for that as well. So.
Yeah, and I'd say for me, it's just using it. That's always the fallback answer, right? But really, I mean, it's going to feel unfamiliar at first and to some degree frustrating, but just remind yourself that you're probably doing something that you shouldn't be doing, and that's a good thing that it's warning you. So there definitely are ways to start out in kind of a softer way, a less strict sort of configuration of TypeScript that will not bug you as much, but will still help you catch obvious mistakes. So that's one approach as well, is just integrating it into your project and kind of starting out in easy mode. But it also, yeah, just going back to the handbook, the TypeScriptLang.org website, going to the handbook, like I find myself really parking on the advanced types page because honestly, conceptually, TypeScript is fairly easy to comprehend. I would just caution against feeling like it's this big overwhelming thing that has just tons of API and tons of options. It really doesn't have that much syntax to learn. It still takes a while to gain an intuition around it for sure. But at a certain point, the real barrier is just describing more complicated things. And so that's where the advanced types comes in. So yeah, that would be where I would recommend somebody at least reading through the handbook first off, get an intuition for it. And then of course, yeah, YouTube, Udemy, Egghead, there's nothing wrong with that for sure. But then ultimately just trying it out.
Yeah, I'll shout out that book I mentioned at the beginning as well, The Effective TypeScript by Dan Vanderkam. That was a really good book for new developers, for people who've already been using TypeScript. It was a great book. It was good. Definitely recommend reading that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would say that book kind of assumes some knowledge of TypeScript, which is fine. So just a heads up there. Probably before you dig into that, maybe read through TypeScript stocks, just get a sense of what's what. Maybe try out the playground. But that's probably really most of what you need, and then some of it will make sense, and some of it will make sense later. So.
Yeah, and that's okay. It's okay to not understand everything about a type system right off the bat. That's totally fine. There's a lot there. There's a lot of depth there.
Yeah, and we as a team, I mean, we've been using TypeScript now for a couple years, and we've kind of organically adopted it as kind of the default, the same default that we all want to utilize. But everyone's on a different end of the spectrum as far as how comfortable they are with TypeScript, or how much they understand, and that's fine. Like the there's always going to be somebody who you can like ask, like, have you ever run into this? So definitely tune in next time for our next video. We're going to talk more about how we actually work with it, maybe share some more examples specifically in React, which is what we primarily use. So I think that's where sometimes you hit some friction, is like, this all makes sense in the abstract. I know how to write a say hi function in TypeScript, big whoop, but how do I actually utilize this in a framework or a library that I'm needing to get stuff done with? So yeah, just rambling.
Cool. No, that's fine. That's fine. Any final thoughts, everyone? Any wrap up thoughts? TypeScript is good. It's mine. I like TypeScript.
Definitely give it a try.
Yeah.
Go through a whole tutorial set, like go to Egghead or something, and they may have like 10 videos. Just work through that. Definitely give it. Yeah, I'd say just give it a try for sure.
And don't feel overwhelmed by it, like you were saying, Rob. And part of like, even as we were reading that book, Effective TypeScript, it was just like, okay, now I know that this is a thing, and if I need to use it, I'll come back to this chapter. Just knowing what's available, you don't have to understand it all now, but you can reference it later.
Yeah, and Google is your friend.
Mm-hmm.
How do I combine two types, or something like that, and you'll find the answer. You don't know what you need until you need it half the time. So that's programming.
Yep. All right. Well, this is a really good conversation. Thanks for joining me, everyone. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Please subscribe to our channel for more content like this. I think we're probably going to have more conversations around TypeScript. We're pretty passionate about it. So we'll see. But thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks.
Bye.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead and end it.